You are warm right now. Maybe you don't notice it. The temperature in your room is regulated, your clothes were designed by engineers, your food was preserved by industrial refrigeration and delivered to within walking distance of where you sleep. You have never, not once, experienced what it means to be cold with no solution. Now imagine that warmth, every source of it, disappearing. Not for a week, not for a season, for 1,000 years. The sun, still rising every morning, still setting every night, but delivering almost nothing. A volcanic winter so severe that summer temperatures dropped by 20 degrees globally. Crops didn't fail, there were no crops. Forests retreated, rivers froze solid for months at a time. The megafauna your ancestors depended on, gone, migrated, or dead. And the cold didn't leave. It stayed, it compounded, it became the permanent condition of being alive on this planet. 1,000 years of this. Your ancestors were inside that. No exit, no end in sight, no way of knowing it would ever stop. And somehow, impossibly, you are here. The question isn't just how they survived it. The question is what kind of people you have to become when survival is no longer a challenge you face. When survival is simply the air you breathe, the only world you've ever known, the only world your children will ever know. That question has an answer, and it will change how you see yourself. Here's what most people assume, that a 1,000-year winter would have broken us, that it would have driven humanity to the edge of extinction, scattered the survivors into isolated, desperate fragments, barely holding on, waiting for warmth that never came. That assumption is wrong, not slightly wrong, catastrophically wrong. What archaeologists began uncovering in the last 30 years, in cave systems across southern Europe, in sediment layers in the Middle East, in frozen ground across Siberia, painted a picture so different from what we expected that several researchers initially refused to publish their findings, not because the data was uncertain, because it was too clean. The winter didn't break us. The winter built us. Let's establish what we're actually talking about. Approximately 42,000 years ago, a geomagnetic reversal event, the Laschamps Excursion, weakened Earth's magnetic field to roughly 6% of its current strength. 6%. The shield that protects this planet from solar radiation didn't disappear, it just became nearly useless. Cosmic radiation flooded the atmosphere. It disrupted the climate systems that regulate temperature across the entire northern hemisphere. Volcanic activity, triggered or amplified by atmospheric destabilization, pumped sulfur dioxide into the upper atmosphere. Sulfur reflects sunlight. Less sunlight means less heat. Less heat means longer winters. Longer winters compound into the next year and the next and the next. Within decades, a feedback loop had locked in. Within centuries, it was simply the world. The people living through the beginning of this had no concept of what was happening in a planetary scale. They didn't have that cognitive framework. What they had was simpler and more brutal. They noticed that it was getting harder. Animals were moving away or dying. The ground stayed frozen longer each year. Children were being born into cold that their grandparents had never experienced. They had a choice that wasn't really a choice. Adapt or disappear. Here is where it gets interesting. The default assumption about prehistoric humans in crisis is regression. Stress breaks complex behavior down into simpler behavior. Societies under pressure contract, technology gets cruder, culture evaporates. That is not what happened. Its sites across the Franco-Cantabrian region of Europe, southern France, northern Spain, the geological record shows something that stops climate researchers mid-sentence when they first encounter it. The period of the most severe temperature decline correlates almost exactly with an explosion of behavioral complexity, not a reduction, an explosion. Cave art, sophisticated bone tools, long-distance trade networks, materials sourced hundreds of miles away, appearing at the same site, evidence of ritual burial, evidence of music, bone flutes, carefully constructed, capable of producing a diatonic scale. The coldest, darkest, most resource-depleted period in human experience for tens of thousands of years, and the response was to make art, to bury the dead with ceremony, to carve music from bone. If you handed that data to a behavioral economist and didn't tell you the context, they would tell you it looks like a civilization expanding into prosperity, not one fighting for survival at -20 in a world without summer. The cold didn't compress human behavior, it concentrated it. Here's the mechanism, and it matters. When resources become scarce and movement becomes restricted by cold and darkness, something happens to group dynamics. The casual social structures of warmer, more abundant times, loose associations, seasonal splitting, individual foraging, those stop working. They stop working fast. What replaces them is tighter. Groups consolidate, strangers become allies out of necessity. Alliances between groups require trust, and trust requires shared language, shared ritual, shared identity. The long winter nights, and they were long, weeks of near darkness in the higher latitudes, forced proximity. Proximity forced communication. Communication, sustained over generations of imposed togetherness, forced something that had never quite existed before in human society at that scale. Culture as survival infrastructure. Not culture as decoration, not art as luxury. Culture as the binding mechanism that held enough humans together in sufficient cooperation across sufficient distance to survive something no individual group could survive alone. The cave paintings weren't escape from the winter, they were the technology of the winter. Visual language that could communicate information about animal migration patterns, seasonal markers, territorial boundaries, preserved on stone walls that outlasted any single human life. Think about what that required, the cognitive leap of understanding that a mark on a wall could carry meaning past your own death, that someone who had never met you could look at what you made and know something true about the world. That leap happened in the dark, in the cold, under a sky that barely protected them from the radiation of space itself. The food problem deserves its own pause. When the megafauna retreated or collapsed, the primary caloric source for most of these populations didn't just decline. For some groups, it nearly vanished inside a single generation. The adaptation wasn't just to find new food, that would have been enough of a challenge. The adaptation was to develop the cognitive and social infrastructure to manage food across time. Storage, not the instinctive hoarding of an individual animal, systematic, planned, socially coordinated storage. Evidence from sites dating to this period shows organized caching, food preserved and marked in ways that suggest community ownership and managed distribution. These were not people scratching for individual survival. These were communities implementing what we would now recognize as resource management policy, deciding collectively how much to consume, how much to preserve, who receives what during scarcity.
The winter forced the invention of economics. Not money, not markets, something more fundamental. The understanding that a resource exists in time, not just in the present moment. That choosing not to consume now creates value later. That future people not yet born, have a claim on present decisions.
Your entire civilization runs on that idea. It was born in a winter that lasted 1,000 years. And then, slowly, it ended. The magnetic field restabilized, atmospheric sulfur dispersed, temperatures climbed, not quickly, not dramatically, but consistently. Over decades, the feedback loop reversed. Summers returned, animals returned, the ground softened. The people who had survived, who had built the social architecture, the cultural technology, the cooperative economics of 1,000-year winter, walked out into a warming world carrying everything they had built inside the cold.
They didn't celebrate. There's no archaeological signature of celebration, no pause in the record. They just kept building. The Neolithic Revolution, agriculture, permanent settlements, the entire scaffolding of what we call civilization came within a few thousand years of the winter ending. Historians have debated its origins for centuries. Why did humans suddenly start farming? Why did permanent settlements appear so rapidly, relatively speaking, after hundreds of thousands of years of simpler living? The winter is the answer that keeps appearing, not as a cause, as a training ground. The cognitive tools, the social structures, the long-term thinking, the cultural identity infrastructure, none of it was invented for farming. It was invented for survival in a world that had no mercy and no end in sight. Farming was just the next application. Civilization was just the next iteration. There is something almost unbearable about this if you sit with it long enough. Every system you depend on, economic, social, cultural, political, traces back through an unbroken chain of inheritance to decisions made by people who were cold, who were afraid, who had no idea if the world would ever be warm again, who had no evidence that what they were building would survive them.
They built it anyway, not because they knew it would matter, but because building was the only response available to a mind that refused to simply wait for death. You did not inherit their genes alone. You inherited their answer to the hardest question a human being can face. What do you do when the world stops cooperating? When the warmth is gone? When there is no horizon of relief in sight? They made art. They made music. They made ceremony for their dead. They drew on walls so that strangers not yet born could know something true. They decided in the coldest dark in human history that meaning was worth creating, even when survival was not guaranteed. You are not the product of their endurance. You are the product of their refusal to let endurance be enough.